I never thought that sentence would end up defining one of the worst decisions of my life. I'm William, and this is a story about a crime I committed almost 12 years ago. I've never posted about it anywhere before. Most people who know me today would never connect me with what happened. I have a stable job, a quiet life, and the kind of routine that makes you look harmless. Maybe that's why I feel comfortable writing this now. The person I was back then feels like someone else, even though I know he was me. At the time, I was 28, broke, angry, and convinced the world owed me something. I had accumulated debt from failed business ideas, unpaid loans, and a gambling habit I spent years pretending wasn't a problem. Every month felt like a slow drowning. Collection agencies called constantly. Friends stopped lending me money. Family members avoided conversations about finances because they were tired of hearing excuses. The crime didn't begin with a weapon or a mask. It began with curiosity. I was working occasional renovation jobs with a small construction crew. Most of the work involved old houses, places that had been remodeled so many times that nobody remembered their original layouts. During one project, I heard an elderly homeowner mention that many homes built in the area during the 1920s contained hidden storage spaces behind walls. Most people would have forgotten the comment. I didn't. A week later, I found myself standing in the dusty hallway of a particularly old house, staring at a section of wall that looked slightly newer than the rest. There was nothing remarkable about it at first glance. Just paint, plaster, and trim. But I couldn't stop thinking about what might be behind it. That obsession led me somewhere much darker than I expected. Looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact moment my curiosity turned into criminal intent. It wasn't when I found evidence of the hidden room. It was when I realized what might be inside. And once that thought entered my head, I started planning. That's when the crime truly began. After that first day, I couldn't get the house out of my mind. The place belonged to a widower named Frank. He lived alone and rarely entered the unfinished sections of the property. During renovations, I spent hours moving through old rooms, studying details that everyone else ignored. The wall in the hallway bothered me. The measurements didn't make sense. The exterior dimensions of the house suggested there should have been extra space hidden somewhere inside. A few days later, while the rest of the crew was working outside, I examined the wall more carefully. I tapped along the surface and listened. Most sections produced a solid sound. One area didn't. Behind it was a hollow space. My heart immediately started racing. I told myself it was professional curiosity, nothing more. Old houses often contained forgotten storage compartments. But as I stood there, imagining what might be hidden beyond the plaster, another thought appeared. Wealthy families had owned the property decades earlier. People hid valuables during wars, economic crashes, and family disputes. That possibility stayed with me. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about architecture. I was thinking about money. And when you're drowning in debt, even a remote chance of finding something valuable can feel impossible to ignore. The discovery should have ended there. A normal person would have reported it to the homeowner and let the mystery be solved the right way. Instead, I started doing research. Every evening after work, I searched property records, old newspaper archives, and local history forums. I learned that the house had changed owners several times over the decades. One family had been involved in a lengthy inheritance dispute. Another had owned a jewelry business that closed under suspicious circumstances. None of it proved anything, but each small detail fed my imagination. Soon I convinced myself that the hidden space contained something valuable: cash, gold, documents, anything that could change my situation overnight. That was the moment I crossed the line. I stopped wondering what was behind the wall and started thinking about how to reach it without anyone noticing. I studied the work schedule, noted when Frank usually left the house, and identified areas where security cameras couldn't see me. Each step seemed small and harmless when viewed alone. Together, they formed a plan. A stupid plan. A criminal plan. And despite knowing that, I kept moving forward. Once I committed to the idea, my thoughts became strangely methodical. I wasn't some mastermind. I was a desperate guy trying to convince himself he was being clever. Still, I approached the situation like a project. I measured the hallway when nobody was looking and estimated where the hollow space began and ended. Then I checked renovation plans stored in the contractor's trailer. The dimensions confirmed my suspicion. There was a narrow room hidden between two sections of the house. The next challenge was access. Breaking through the wall during working hours was impossible. Someone would notice immediately. so I decided to return at night. For nearly 2 weeks, I prepared. I bought inexpensive tools with cash, avoided discussing the house with coworkers, and created excuses for where I'd be in the evenings. The more effort I invested, the harder it became to walk away. That's something people rarely talk about. Every bad decision becomes easier after you've spent time preparing for it. You start treating the plan like an investment. By then, I wasn't asking whether I should do it. I was asking when. The opportunity came on a rainy Thursday. Frank had mentioned he would be visiting relatives in another town and wouldn't return until the following afternoon. I acted indifferent when he said it, but inside I felt a surge of excitement. The house would be empty all night. That evening, I parked several streets away and walked through the rain carrying a small backpack. Every sound seemed louder than normal: the wind, passing cars, even my own footsteps. I remember checking over my shoulder constantly, convinced someone was watching. The side entrance was easier to access than I expected. During renovations, temporary locks had been installed, and I knew exactly how they worked. Within minutes I was inside. The house felt completely different at night. During the day it was full of noise. Drills, voices, movement. Now it was silent. The darkness made every room seem unfamiliar. My flashlight beam swept across dusty floors and unfinished walls as I moved toward the hallway. When I finally stood in front of the hidden section again, my pulse was pounding. For weeks I had imagined this moment. Now there was no turning back. I started carefully. The last thing I wanted was to cause obvious damage that couldn't be explained later. Using a small pry bar and utility knife, I worked around the edges of the section that sounded hollow. Every scrape seemed deafening in the silence. More than once I froze, listening for footsteps that never came. After nearly 20 minutes, a portion of the wall finally shifted. A narrow opening appeared. I remember staring at the darkness beyond it, suddenly nervous. For weeks I'd been obsessed with getting inside, but now that I could, a strange feeling settled over me. It wasn't guilt yet. It was uncertainty. Still, I squeezed through. The hidden room was smaller than I'd imagined, maybe 8 feet wide and 12 feet long. Dust covered everything. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. My flashlight revealed shelves, old trunks, and piles of forgotten belongings. For a moment I felt disappointed. Then my beam landed on a locked metal box tucked beneath one of the shelves. And just like that, the excitement came rushing back. I was certain I'd found what I'd been looking for. The metal box wasn't large, but it was heavy. I pulled it into the center of the room and brushed away years of dust. The lock was old and badly corroded. Part of me hoped it would simply fall apart, saving me the trouble. It didn't. For several minutes I worked at it with my tools, growing more frustrated with each failed attempt. The excitement that had carried me into the room was beginning to fade, replaced by anxiety. I kept imagining Frank returning unexpectedly or a neighbor noticing a light inside the house. Then, with a sharp crack, the lock gave way. I opened the lid. Inside were bundles of documents, several pieces of jewelry, and a collection of old coins sealed in protective sleeves. At first I felt confused. There wasn't a mountain of cash waiting for me. There wasn't some movie-style treasure chest. But the jewelry looked valuable. Very valuable. My hands actually shook as I picked up a gold necklace and examined it under the flashlight. In that moment, all the rationalizations I'd built over the previous weeks took control. I wasn't discovering property anymore. I was stealing it. I wish I could say I stopped and thought about the consequences. I didn't. I filled my backpack with the jewelry, several coin sleeves, and a handful of documents that looked important. Looking back, taking the papers was a mistake. Valuable items can be sold. Documents create questions. The whole time, I kept hearing imaginary sounds. A floorboard creaking. A car door outside. Someone entering the house. My nerves were completely shot. Then something happened that I hadn't planned for. While searching one of the shelves, I knocked over a wooden box. It hit the floor harder than I expected and burst open. Photographs scattered everywhere. I bent down to collect them and accidentally looked at a few. They showed generations of the same family birthdays, weddings, children standing in front of the house decades earlier. Suddenly the room felt different. Until then, I'd been thinking about objects, money, debt. Now I was staring at pieces of people's lives. For the first time that night, guilt slipped through the excitement. But instead of leaving, I hurried. And rushing is when people make their biggest mistakes. I left the hidden room in a panic. Not because I heard anyone inside the house, but because the guilt was starting to catch up with me. I sealed the opening as best I could, gathered my tools, and headed for the side entrance. All I wanted was to get home and convince myself the whole thing had been worth it. Then I stepped outside. Across the street, under the glow of a street lamp, a man was standing with a dog. At first I thought nothing of it. Then he looked directly at me. We held eye contact for only a second, but it felt much longer. I immediately turned away and started walking. Not running would attract attention. Just walking, trying to appear normal while every alarm bell in my head screamed. The man didn't say anything. The dog barked once. That was it. Yet the encounter followed me all the way home. By the time I reached my apartment, I had convinced myself the neighbor had memorized my face, my clothes, and probably the exact time I left the property. Fear had officially replaced excitement. The next morning, I barely slept. Every vibration from my phone made me jump. I expected a call from my boss, the police, or Frank. Instead, the morning passed quietly. For a few hours, I convinced myself that maybe everything had worked out. Then, shortly after lunch, chaos started. Frank returned home earlier than expected and apparently noticed signs that something was wrong. I wasn't there when it happened, but I heard the story from co-workers later. He had discovered damage behind the hallway wall and uncovered the hidden room himself. The renovation site became the center of attention almost immediately. Police officers arrived. Questions were asked. People were interviewed. When I heard the news, my stomach dropped. The hidden room was no longer a secret. Worse, everyone now knew valuables had been stored inside. At work, I forced myself to act surprised. I listened to conversations, nodded at the appropriate moments, and pretended to be fascinated by the discovery. Every word felt dangerous. I worried that my voice sounded strange or that someone would notice how nervous I was. Nobody did. At least not yet. The investigation wasn't dramatic like in movies. Nobody burst through my door. Nobody accused me directly. Instead, the pressure came from uncertainty. Days passed without answers, and that somehow felt worse. I knew I couldn't keep the stolen items in my apartment forever. Every time I looked at the backpack hidden in my closet, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief because it represented money I desperately needed. Dread because it was evidence. So I started making more bad decisions. I separated the items into different containers and stored them in multiple locations. A few pieces of jewelry went into a rented storage unit under a friend's name. The coins stayed with me. The documents, which I still didn't fully understand, were hidden inside a box of old books. Meanwhile, rumors spread around the job site. Some people thought an outsider had broken in. Others suspected a former owner knew about the room. I encouraged those theories whenever possible. Not aggressively, just enough. Each small lie seemed harmless. Together, they slowly transformed me into someone I barely recognized. About 3 weeks after the break-in, I discovered something that terrified me more than the police investigation. The documents. Until then, I had treated them like an afterthought. The jewelry was what mattered. The papers had simply been scooped into my backpack during the rush to leave. One evening I finally decided to examine them properly. Most were old letters, receipts, and legal records. Then I found a folder. Inside were handwritten notes related to the inheritance dispute I'd read about during my research. The contents weren't valuable in a financial sense, but they explained why the hidden room had existed in the first place. More importantly, they identified several surviving family members who had spent years searching for missing possessions connected to the estate. Suddenly the crime felt personal. These weren't forgotten treasures abandoned by history. They belonged to real people who were still alive. That realization hit harder than I expected. I couldn't stop thinking about the photographs I'd seen scattered across the floor. Faces that had seemed distant now felt connected to names, stories, and descendants. For the first time, I seriously considered returning everything. Just as I was debating what to do, another problem appeared. One afternoon, I stopped by the renovation site to pick up equipment. As I was loading tools into a truck, I saw him. The man with the dog. My chest tightened immediately. He was standing near the sidewalk talking to Frank and one of the police officers who had occasionally visited the property. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I recognized him instantly. The same jacket, the same face, the same calm expression from that rainy night. For several seconds, I was convinced everything was over. I imagined him pointing at me and saying, "That's the guy I saw leaving the house." Instead, nothing happened. The conversation continued. Nobody looked in my direction. Still, panic took over. I left as quickly as I could without drawing attention and spent the rest of the day imagining worst-case scenarios. The strange thing about guilt is that it creates its own punishment. Even when nobody is accusing you, you begin accusing yourself. Every glance feels suspicious. Every question sounds like an interrogation. By then, I was exhausted from carrying the secret. A month later, the pressure finally became unbearable. I couldn't enjoy the money because I hadn't sold anything yet. I couldn't relax because every day felt like I was waiting for disaster. The stolen property had become a burden instead of a reward. One night, I spread everything across my apartment floor. The jewelry, the coins, the documents. I stared at them for hours. When I first entered the hidden room, I had imagined these items would solve my problems. Instead, they had created new ones. My debts were still there. My life was still a mess. The only difference was that now I carried guilt alongside everything else. Around midnight, I made a decision. I packed the documents and most of the valuables into several boxes. A few days later, using an anonymous shipping service in another city, I arranged for them to be delivered to the attorney handling matters related to the estate. I included no name, no explanation, just the items. It wasn't a noble act. I wasn't confessing. I was trying to escape the weight of what I'd done. And surprisingly, it helped. I was never arrested. As far as I know, the returned items were accepted without anyone discovering who sent them. The investigation gradually lost momentum. No charges were filed. No dramatic confession took place. Life simply moved on. But getting away with a crime isn't the same thing as escaping it. For years, I thought about that hidden room. Not because of the valuables, but because of what the experience revealed about me. I had always imagined criminals as fundamentally different from ordinary people. Then I became one. Not through violence or hatred, but through a series of small choices, each one easier than the last. That's the part that still bothers me. The crime didn't begin when I opened the wall. It began when I started justifying things. I told myself I deserved a break. I told myself nobody would be hurt. I told myself I was only taking what fate had placed in front of me. Every lie made the next lie easier. If there's any lesson here, it's this. Desperation can explain bad decisions, but it doesn't excuse them. And once you cross a line, becoming the person you swore you'd never be is frighteningly easy.